Good morning. We're going to start our Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia, round 3. This is the 3rd year we're doing it in the Caucasus. I'm Ronald Suny. You may or may not have met our leader, Anna Borisovna Vasilyeva, and you'll meet everybody else. I'm not going to ask for introductions because you're going to meet and greet each other spontaneously through various seminars. I urge you to be bold, to ask questions. You can even if you're bold enough, interrupt me during the talk. And I remind you that we operate by the Chatham House rules, that we don't publicly ascribe anything said in the seminar to any particular person, okay? So what I intend to do today is I have 2 papers which I'm going to read from or talk from. One is 80 pages, the other is 36 pages. So clearly this will not be the hour that we're faced with. And I'll try to talk for 30 or 40 minutes and open it up to questions. I'm going to give sort of 3 different mini lectures. One is going to be a follow-up. Those of you who were with us during the virtual session with George Beebe and his discussion of strategic empathy will remember that concept that basically was, if you're going to do foreign policy, put yourself in the other guy's shoes. Think about what they may be thinking before you, in fact, generate your own response. So I want to follow that with a more specific discussion about Russia, which is the center of our enterprise. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 concepts which may or may not be as familiar to you in the particular way that I'm going to discuss it: empire and nation, which I think is a central theme of the course we're going to go on. And thirdly, if we have time, and I will try to make time, I want to talk specifically about Sakartvelo, that is Georgia, and how it became a nation in the modern sense of nation. All right, those are the 3 things I want to do. Those of you who are old enough, and most people here I think are, will know that roughly around the time of the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union, suddenly in scholarship in the West, the concept of empire had a resurrection. Suddenly everyone's talking again about empire. It became the sort of intellectual flavor of the month. And this was just at the moment when the United States was confidently proclaiming its own right to global hegemony and was being called an empire. I don't use that term empire for the United States. I talk about global hegemony. But it became fashionable with certain powers in the world, namely the United States, Russia later on, Israel, and some others, to think that it could both claim it's observing the liberal international order, which we all subscribe to and think is a pretty good idea, but break those rules at will. Nobody else can do it, but these powers think they can do it. So preventive war, need I mention that one just occurred a week ago, preemption, new ideas about the specter of empire, all these things began to happen and were being questioned and redefined. So now what I'm going to do in this first part of this first little mini lecture is begin with what we call, I'll try to explain this a little bit later if it's not familiar to all. Many of these things I'm going to say are going to be banal to some of you, and some of you, they'll be brand new. But we're going to start sort of with common understandings. So I'm going to begin with what we call a constructivist approach to international relations. And I'm going to talk about how foreign policy is not merely a product of geographical and historically determined imperatives or opportunities, or the differential in power among states, but more importantly, foreign policy is determined by perceptions, ideas, and identities that are articulated as, quote unquote, national interests to be defended and promoted in the international arena. So that's the major thesis of this presentation, first part. An identification, in other words, as an empire, which some people claim is what Putin is doing, has effects on perceived interests. So identities lead to interests. that differ from identification as a nation state. States act, it seems to me, and I'm going to argue this, on the basis of their perceived interests, but also on the conceptions of the kind of state they are, its historical purposes and operative belief systems, as well as the discursive universe. What's that mean? That means the universe of available meanings and understandings at any historical moment in which it operates. And these are all fundamental to the construction of its interests. Now that sounds very abstract, I'm sorry, Kerry, but it will become more concrete as I go on. Now what if I turn to Russia and I try to argue in this idea of strategic empathy from that approach, what would be some of the factors that would help to explain over time the foreign policy of Russia and the Soviet Union? And of course, if they're about perceptions and historical context, they will change over time, but some things might be constant over time for a variety of reasons. So I've outlined 6 factors. I like lists, right? So keep those in mind. First of all, and this might seem counterintuitive to some, Russian and Soviet, and today Russian foreign policy, over many centuries, I think I could argue, with some few brief exceptions, has been principally guided by its leaders' perception of weakness, of vulnerability, and insecurity. So if US is a security state, the Soviet Union and Russia were insecurity states. And particularly this is true vis-a-vis its international and nearby competitors. The second factor I would say is that among the most fundamental sources of this weakness of the Russian state is, ironically, its size and its place geographically and within the structures of the international order. Russia, by its very size as the largest state in the world, presents a security dilemma to its neighbors, Poland or Sweden, whoever happens to be, Turkey, and also far from its borders. Russia is a country without, or has been, clearly defined borders. It is a country of low population density and a relatively under-articulated social and communications infrastructure. And those things have led to this fundamental source of weakness. You could add others. The third factor, I would argue, in trying to understand what Russia's about in foreign policy is that it's a multinational state. And in many of its iterations, it has been an empire whose imperial history has produced, over time, a fragile, fragmented national identity that has consequences for its generation of interests. So Russia is trying to figure out who it is all the time. And they even have contests about who it is. They never quite come to a conclusion. And Putin is, in fact, currently developing his own idea of that national identity. The structure and ideology of empire, as well as the cost and constraints of an imperial system, they themselves have contributed to a lack of social and economic dynamism and resistance to reform. And I'll try to explain later when I talk about the definition of empire, why in my definition of empire, which is not descriptive but analytical, there are reasons why if you're an empire and operate as an empire, you have certain kinds of dynamics more likely to happen than not. Fourth thing is that although Russian leaders have often, like Putin at times, thought in realist terms, I think you know what realist means, and I'll talk about that a bit more, their self-conceptions, their identities, and their ideas of history and narratives about the past and future have influenced their perceptions of Russia's interests. So ideology in some broad sense of kind of discourse of politics, rather than simple realpolitik, which of course itself is an ideology. It's not just given, it's not an ontology, it's an ideology, it's a kind of epistemology. Realpolitik or realism itself has played a motivating and sometimes debilitating role in determining policy. Fifthly, Russia's internal composition, its multinationality, its own infrastructural weaknesses, whatever, deriving from its historical formation and geopolitical location, are key factors in defining its identities and interests. So identities, again, lead to interests in my analysis. And then let's not forget, for the sixth and final factor, Russia today, as in much of its past, like Georgia and Armenia, the other two countries we're going to be examining in this seminar, Russia lives in a dangerous neighborhood with enemies or perceived enemies. And by the way, threats are always perceptions. Not always. I mean, if a lion is roaring toward you, maybe that's not a perceived fear, right, or threat. But in general, they're perceptions. So these real and perceived dangers and vulnerabilities that Russia has imagined and that lead to its weakness and insecurity have come from inside their own country, sometimes from peripheries like Chechnya or Central Asia, maybe. Sometimes they've come from the near abroad, outside, maybe the spread of Islam or whatever. It's come from things like the expansion of NATO and the threats, real and perceived, from other great powers. So Russia is a country that was invaded twice in the 20th century. So, national interest. Now, national interest, in the most common approach, has always argued in political science and in governmental behavior as if it were objective, unavoidable, and a permanent fact of life. And therefore, as Lord Palmerston most famously said, you have to take account. He wrote, "England has neither permanent friends nor permanent enemies. She has permanent interests," right? Or Machiavelli might be another person who has said this, Clausewitz, Hans Morgan, George Kennan, Kenneth Waltz, realist theorist, and my favorite, John Mearsheimer, who was my colleague at Chicago. Mearsheimer is a name that when at the last Slavic convention, at a Ukrainian panel, they refused to say his name. They refused even to mention his name. He's so abhorrent to Ukrainians at the moment. So that's one view, that national interest is given, it's permanent, that's it. But the second approach is, and this is the more constructivist approach, is that national interest is a subjective understanding of the way the world works. It's a cognitive and emotional calculation of what is desirable or needed. It is related to what I call an affective disposition, the way you think about emotionally and cognitively the way the world works. And given that that the state, having given fixed and permanent interests in this view, it's individuals and groups in society that have interests that influence and shape what is understood to be the national interest. Now, I remember once at a conference, I asked about Russia's national interests, and Mike McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, American ambassador to Russia, said, Russia doesn't have national interests. What are being expressed today are Putin's national interests. I don't think he quite meant it in the same subjective way that I do, but in other words, it's Putin's desires, the single person that will determine it. So, most people, and I also would agree with this, in terms of realism and the realist approach to international affairs, would say that there are some irreducible factors, like the fact that in the international system of states, they all operate in an anarchic international arena, that there's no super authority over international affairs, not the UN, not the liberal international order. And so everyone is out for himself. So the realist, Mearsheimer, who's what we call an extreme realist or offensive realist, also would hold this. And Mearsheimer would say, each state fears the other and seeks the largest share of world power. So every state, I guess that includes Armenia, Georgia, and Denmark, wants to become a hegemon, right? This is the offensive realist position. And offensive realisms, and realists in general, more moderate, nicer, benign realists, also believe they reject the liberal, which is the other school of international affairs theory generally, that you should consider the internal characteristics of states. That is, if they're democratic or authoritarian, dictatorships or whatever, they might have different kinds of approaches to international affairs. So liberals, in the liberal theory, you take all of that into account, and their big axiom is democracies don't go to war, right? That's what they argue. And everybody goes, wait a minute, what's 1812? Oh, does that fit? You know, the War of 1812 or whatever. But there's that theory as well. Now, there are also nicer realists, like defensive realists, like Kenneth Waltz, my own teacher, who assume that states simply seek to preserve the balance of power rather than simply become all-powerful hegemons. All right. Now, as I said, or hinted before, in my view, the realist view is not, as it claims, an ontology, that is the real way the world works, inevitably, but is an epistemology, that is the way that people like Mearsheimer and other theorists and many, many, many state leaders think the world works. If enough people think the world works that way, that approaches some kind of ontology because they're thinking this is the way the world works. We're going to operate on that view. But I'm saying, along with what we call constructivists, like Alexander Wendt or Ted Hupf and others, that it's not an objective thing, but what people believe is the way the world actually is and operates, right? So one has to consider then what the assumptions of world leaders and pivotal actors are about themselves, their state identities, these are variables to be considered, and how they likely depend on historical, cultural, political, and social context. So the constructivist theory is a radically historicist theory, like Marxism. It argues you have to consider time and place, the context, the discursive universe in which people are operating. These things are not transhistorical. There are some transhistorical factors that you might consider, but more importantly, the way ideas constitute identities and interests, the way in which, some sense, interests are ideas. That's important. All right. Now, I'm going to claim my own radical middle theory, because I like to borrow from anyone I can, and it is a bit eclectic, and say that here's where I would come down in this jumble of international relations theories. How am I doing on time? Oh, going not good enough. All right. I think you can say that one of the factors, permanent factors, at least in most cases, is that state leaders wish to preserve territorial integrity and, to the extent possible, the sovereignty of their states, right? In general, that seems to be safe. In some cases, they might not. Russia, for instance, or the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, seems to have given up willy-nilly without receiving anything in response, the victories and territorial hegemonies that it had after World War II, right? And territory as well. Okay, second, as I said, the international system is in general anarchic. No uncontested, universally recognized supranational authority to settle disputes or enforce agreements among states. So, in other words, world leaders have to realize that the international system is a self-help system, right? It's something that also Gorbachev failed to do, right? And it's you and maybe your allies maybe if you bandwagon with them, something like that. I would say another factor that is generally trans-historical in a way is that leaders want to stay in power. State leaders want to stay in power, increase their domestic base of support by appealing to different constituents to preserve that part of the existing political order that secures their leader's position of power. So there's a domestic connotation or component here. Foreign policy defeats are to be avoided, like domestic defeats. They weaken the state leaders, and they want to avoid that. Another permanent factor for most states is that military force is a constant possibility, a choice to be made, particularly by very powerful states like Israel, Russia, and the United States. And unlike the realists, I would say, like the liberals, you would have to say domestic policies, institutions, and powerful social groups and whatever you want to call them, constituencies, influence domestic and foreign policy ends and the means that coincide with those particular interests. So I'm going to argue that regime types, democracies, authoritarian states, empires, nation states, they have different self-conceptions, different ambitions. They act somewhat differently, but within the constraints of these more general factors. So I think that is basically what you have to consider. And very importantly, this word that we use and overuse of discourse or discursive environments has to be taken very seriously. Structures do not determine actions in an unmediated way. They operate through the way people perceive, understand, discursively construct those interests. So you're affected somewhat by these objective factors, but much more importantly, level of economic development, let's say, or your military prowess, et cetera, important. But also questions like states' reputation is important. Not so much to Donald Trump, but apparently not so much to Putin, but very often in other connotation. So that's my sort of international relations take. And I think all those factors we can think about while we're trying to think about through the seminar what Russia may or may not, what does Putin think, what is Russian interests, et cetera. And we can raise those questions in questions. Second thing the second little mini lecture is about empire and nations as regime types, right? Now, Russian regimes have undergone a lot of momentous changes over time, some revolutionary, some evolutionary, and these have affected their identities and related interests. Think about it. Over the last 3 centuries, Russia has given rise to 6 regime types. From 1700 to 1825, you could say they had the Petrine Empire. From 1825 to 1917, they had what I would call the modernizing empire. From 1917 to 1932, they had what I would call an internationalist state of nations. From 1932 to 1985, they were a kind of nationalizing empire. These are my choices, by the way. From 1985 to 91, they were a transitory empire, self-destructing, in fact. And from 1991 on, a weakened multinational state with ambitions of hegemony. So Russia is interested in hegemony, in expanding its power hegemonically. The difference between hegemony and empire, in my view, I know I'm going fast and throwing out a lot of stuff here, try to do this in 40 minutes. Empire is when one metropolitan power controls the domestic and foreign policy of others. Hegemony is when you control or try to determine in some way the foreign policies of other states, but they can do what they want domestically. So Stalinism was an empirical control over East Central Europe, let's say, from 1947 to roughly 1956. But after that, it was hegemony. It was, go ahead, you can decollectivize now in Poland. In Hungary, you can do goulash communism, but you still have to be a member of the Soviet bloc and Warsaw Bloc, and if not, we'll invade you. right, as they did in 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia. So that's the difference between hegemony. So I see the United States as a hegemon, not an empire, trying to determine loyalties and alliances and dominance in various ways, but not controlling the rest of the world as colonies. We don't need that. So what is an empire? Now, when I define empire in this context, I'm largely speaking of a state regime type, right? But it does apply as well to overseas empires. An empire is a particular form of domination or control between two units of some kind, which are set apart and defined in a hierarchical, inequitable relationship. So there are two things here in empire. Difference, so there's a difference between the metropole and the periphery, and that difference is interpreted as, or made institutionally, inequitable. One is dominant and superior, the other is inferior. Think of the British in India, right? The British, a small number of Brits, controlled hundreds of millions of Indians. They were considered themselves superior, and the Indians were inferior, and many Indians sadly bought into that. So an empire, if described in that particular way about difference and hierarchy, has certain dynamics built into it. Like it has to maintain those distinctions. So intermarriage in Southeast Asia or Indonesia was not something that the metropolitan Dutch or French wanted, because it blurred the line between the superiors and the inferiors. Ann Stoller has written a lot about this, right? So you want to maintain those distinctions. You want to maintain those hierarchies. So that means that empires are going to find it very hard to reform themselves in the Ottoman Tanzimat or the Russian period of reform toward democracy, because the nation state and democracy will eliminate those hierarchies. So they've got to maintain them. And if you know your history of Russia, in the very late period of the Tsarist Empire, the state council was resisting a lot any diminishment, any diminution, whatever that word is in English, of its superior power, right? Roberta Manning has written about that. So we have a lot of evidence of that. So you got to maintain that. So there's dynamics in empire that prevent certain kinds of reform and trouble empire. Because there's another ideal type. These are ideal types, right? And you could use tens of examples where they don't quite fit, but they tell you a lot. The other ideal type is the nation state. So if empire is about difference and hierarchy, the nation state ideally, and there's a striving toward that, is about equality or, equivalence and homogeneity. So nation states do have a propensity toward homogenization of the population. Either as civically, we're all Americans, we all subscribe to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution until recently, we're all citizens. In an empire, you're a subject. That means you're inferior to the ruling power. One of my favorite concepts, which I think I developed, but who knows, probably Karl Marx said it before me, or Aristotle. He got there first. He said everything first, so we're all just following Aristotle. Is what I call the dilemma of empire, or the dialectic of empire. Empires in the 19th century particularly, rather than simply relying on coercion, because after all, empires are made by conquest, right? And then they say, oh, I have the right to rule here because my father ruled here, right? Dynastic rule and so forth. Empires begin to justify their superior ruling, and they develop a developmentalist idea. And this is the famous mission civilisatrice. You let us rule you, and we'll civilize you. We'll make you better. We'll educate you. We'll modernize you. We'll build railroads, and so forth and so on. Now, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungary, the British in India, the French in Algeria, all had civilizing missions or modernizing missions. But here's the dilemma of empire. What if you actually civilize them? What if a Gandhi and a Nehru appear? What if in Russia, in the Soviet Union, you actually do create a totally literate society? You change an 80% peasant society into an 80% urban society. What if in the Soviet Union, you turn an 80% agrarian economy into an industrial urban economy? Who needs the empire? Who needs the imperial institution, which in the Soviet case was the nomenklatura, the ruling communist elite? You don't. So off go people and create their own nation states or whatever, right? That's a kind of structuralist way, simplification of trying to explain. In other words, empires have within them, by their very civilizing mission, creating the civil service and intellectuals in India or whatever, or in Georgia, right? I remember in Georgia when I was here in the 1970s, certain intellectuals who remain nameless believed that Georgia could be independent. Because we have our own intelligentsia, we have a civil society, they called it a civil society, not guaranteed by law, but nevertheless, and we can become independent. Of course, it was another 30 years before they actually achieved that, and they achieved that because the center committed suicide, not because of necessarily what they did. So what is a nation? A nation is a group of people that imagines itself to be a political community distinct from the rest of humankind. And a nation, let's say Armenians, Georgians, Lithuanians, Americans, imagines itself that it shares characteristics. It could be ethnic origins, values, historical experiences, religion, language, territory. And on the basis of a defined culture, this is a very bizarre idea, on the basis of a defined culture, they are entitled to self-determination, which usually entails control of their own territory, the homeland, Heidenik, Samshoblo, Rodina, right, Heimat, and the state. The discourse of the nation, which arises in the late 18th century and is powerfully embedded by the 19th century, argues that culture gives you political rights. Not dynasty, not conquest, not God, right? Sovereignty used to come from God through the kings, now from the people who imagine themselves to have a shared culture. So see how different nation state, in its ideal form, is different from an empire in its ideal form. Okay, let's look now at Georgia. I'm Armenian by background. My parents were Armenian. One was born in the States, one was born in Trabzon, near Trabzon, as they were fleeing the Turks. And they lived in Tbilisi, in Sololaki, which you'll see when you get to Tbilisi. It was an Armenian rayon, Armenian district at the time. So I came to Georgia and, loving Georgia, tried to learn the language, which is nearly impossible for someone like me, but you try as hard as you can. And I wrote a book called The Making of the Georgian Nation, which is now translated into Georgian. And when the book came out, I was attacked. Every book I wrote was attacked in the Soviet Union. So in America, I was attacked for being a Marxist. There, I said it. And in the Soviet Union, I was bourgeoisny falsifikator Istoria Azerbaijana for my first book, because I wrote a book on Azerbaijan. And in Georgia, I was condemned for being naive and anti-national, anti-Georgian, etc. What was the reason for that? Because when I said making of the Georgian nation, if I had only said making of the modern Georgian nation, nation in the sense that I've defined it today. Because Georgia was many different things and conceived of itself, Georgian intellectuals, clerics, leaders, through the ages. But in modern times, they began to see themselves not as a primarily religious group. Armenians, for instance, were largely an ethno-religious community through most of their history. But by the 19th century, the radical intelligentsia, both in Georgia and in Armenia, began to think, no, we're a nation. in that same sense that those people over there in Europe are saying they're a nation. And religion is part of it. It's actually religion and language and history, and that'll make us a nation. And so something began to develop before, in that new sense. Now, let me just, in the last 4 minutes, tell you a story about how Georgians imagine themselves in the Middle Ages and why it's different from today. So Georgia has an old and long historical tradition, and there are a number of wonderful medieval chronicles called Constructivist, the life of Georgia. And Georgia was one of the major Christian communities in the Caucasus. Now, Armenia was also Christian, and to become Christian slightly earlier than Georgians. And in the first iteration, Georgians borrowed this religion, this Orthodox Christianity, from Armenians. And they also had relations from the 7th century on, with another people who had come into the area, namely Muslims. Right? There were Arab empires came up. And these people, Muslims, Armenians, Georgians, all defined in certain ways, language, religion, whatever, lived together in a complicated symbiosis that involved interrelations, conflict, intermarriage, blending of culture at various levels, borrowing from one another, trade, dynastic infighting, cross-ethnic alliances, migration, and fluctuating frontiers, because empires are about the mixing of people, the same way that, in the ideal way, nations are about the homogenization of people, the unmixing of people. Eventually, Georgians would distinguish themselves from Armenians, not only by language, but in the 6th century, the Georgian church chose to free itself of Armenian domination and identify with the Greek Orthodox Church of Byzantium. So the Georgians are Orthodox, right? Armenians are not Orthodox in any way. Armenians are Monophysites. We have our own church, and we don't want anyone else coming in. We don't proselytize. We just are Armenians. We're happy to be that because Armenians think we're better than everyone else, right? We are the oldest Christian church, state. We were Christians before Christ, even. Not really, but anyway, but we are very proud and very, very we even call Russians Soch, right? Which means onion. So we even look down on the Russians who ruled over us, let alone the Turks and the Persians. Okay. Now, in the 6th century, this Kartvelian Eastern Georgian church freed itself of Armenian domination and identified with the Greek Orthodox Church. And later in the Georgian kingdoms of David Akhmashenebeli and Tamar Mepe, the great kings of medieval Georgia, you'll learn that, Georgia was formed as a multinational, multi-religious, multicultural state, a kind of mini empire. Armenians here, Muslims dominated the cities in some places. Gori was built by the king, I think it was David, for Armenians, etc. So they were more like empires than modern nation states. In the early Georgian sources, in the Kartlitz-Chovraba, around 800 AD, the Georgian scribes wrote, all the major Caucasian people have a single forefather, one ancient founder, Targarmos, who was a descendant, of course, of Noah, right? Moreover, Targarmos' first son was Hauz, or Haik. Haik, familiar? The founder of the Armenians, who was the elder son and superior, this is the Georgian Chronicle, to his younger brother, Carlos, the founder of the Georgians. My own student, Stephen Rapp, a great medieval Georgianist, writes the following. Around 800, Georgian historians were not nationalist. And this Georgian historian, whoever wrote Kartlitz-Chovraba, faithfully retransmitted the received Armenian traditions, though reworking them for a Kartvelian, that's East Georgian, audience. Hauz slew Nimrod, thus liberated his own and his brother's peoples. The chronicles also claim that Georgians spoke Armenian, it's Armenians, again, being superior, before the mythical invasion of Alexander the Great. And only then did they create Ena Kartuli, the Georgian language. So it's very interesting that in these early sources, there's this close relationship between Armenians and Georgians. Now later, under the Georgian Bagratids, a dynasty, by the way, that's related to the Bagratunis of Armenia, they all come from a place called Taos. They are originally from there. They began to distance themselves further from their Armenian cousins, obscured this common ancestry, and emphasized instead unique Georgian qualities. So what you see in these ancient Georgian texts is that Georgians are fighting over a number of competing ideas of Georgian identity available from the past. And over time, particularly by the late 18th century, 19th century, they become more and more Georgia-centric and more what we would call nationalists. And eventually they get borrowed by a secular intelligentsia, people like Chavchavadze, who you'll find out about, Ilya Chavchavadze, now a saint in the Georgian church, Akaki Tsereteli, and others. I won't tell you that whole history. Later, when we talk about Stalin and so forth, I'll bring you up to date on the formation of the modern Georgian nation. But I think that's it for the time being. Let's open it up for questions.